Welcome to patch 25.S1.3. With this patch, Riot is introducing a streamer mode. This will replace account names with the champion name from the loading screen all the way through the end of the game from the view of the player that has this enabled. This addition is intended to help reduce incidents of things like stream sniping, or other forms of streamer harassment or disruption. To enable streamer mode, all you need to do is enable this setting in the interface settings in the client. Just navigate to Settings, Interface, Health and Resource bars. The average power level of champions has slowly risen over the last decade and a half of League, and one place that hasn't always kept up is repeated auto attacks. As effective health totals and ability damage have improved, it's time to make sure late game attacks can keep pace, so Riot is bumping the theoretical top-end DPS by up to 20%. Riot thinks there's a hard cap in how fast champions should be able to attack in most cases so that even in late game scenarios they're playable for mere mortals, but Riot thinks 3 attacks per second is reasonable. Riot is continuing to turn the champion bounties for losing teams knob, this time more aggressively than the previous. There's still more room to go here if Riot needs to, but they want to further reduce the number of times one lone champion has a bounty, trying to prop their team up like Atlas with Earth. Chemtech currently is the worst performing Dragon Soul of them all, so Riot is giving it some needed power so it can feel a bit more impactful when compared to its Soul siblings. Cloud Soul is currently the best both by data and perception in higher skilled play. Riot is nerfing its passive movement speed gain as it's quite difficult to answer once acquired. Riot believes that Void Grubs are currently too valuable, so they're nerfing their buff damage along with ensuring they correctly update their health and attack damage on spawn. On initial spawn, health and attack damage update immediately instead of at 604. Voracious Atakhan's win rate impact actually managed to go up over the last patch, despite the nerfs, so Riot is adding a few more on, including increasing the time it takes for players to get back onto the map when their false life withdrawal triggers. Cassiopeia was a strong performer before feats of strength and she's still excellent after her recent nerf. Riot wants to preserve her ability to take a few hits as a mid-range battle mage and preserve Twin Fang as much as possible, but they don't want to weaken her already poor laning phase. So Riot is tapping down some of her late game damage that comes from less exciting sources. Evelynn isn't doing very well, even for those who correctly max Allure second. Riot wants to buff her for all players and especially close the gap between the intuitive E max and overall stronger W max. As she's already quite snowbally, reliant on Mahai's Soulstealer and Rabadon's death cap, Riot wants to give her a bit more of a fallback pattern, letting her hit assassination thresholds more easily on squishier targets even when not ahead in gold or stacks. Galio should be more vulnerable early given his powerful first item spike, so Riot is looking to increase counterplay by reducing his base health, especially since he performs best in high skill brackets. Shadow Assassin Kayn is definitely the weaker option right now, which just isn't fair to this double-edged lord. By ramping up his Q damage, Riot can ensure he'll be more lethal when not playing as Rost, who replaces his Q anyway. Jax is weak, especially at lower ranks. With the removal of Biscuit's mana, Jax's mana issues have become a more real problem, so Riot is buffing base mana regen to compensate. Riot is also giving him a bit more health per level since his HP scaling was well below other comparable champions in his class and using this as a catch-all generic power buff. Buffing Art trigger damage also is just an all skill levels power increase. Tank Jace is overpresent in pro play and players haven't been happy to see him played as a tank. Over time a lot of Jace's buffs have been base damage increases, so Riot is pulling those back and giving compensation buffs to AD ratios on all of his primary damage sources. This should be power neutral for AD Jace but ultimately a nerf across the board for any Jace that isn't building AD. Riot wants to slowly trim late game armor from the game over the course of the year, partially in an effort to make physical lethality builds not fall off as steep of a cliff as games go on. Miss Fortune is one such champion who has room to siphon some armor away. As she's overly strong in the laning phase especially, the brunt of this nerf is actually to her early game, though even base armor tends to have far-reaching effects with game time. Nasus got hit too hard from his last nerf along with losing some power this season and Riot wants to return some of his passive sustain which should help him function throughout the game. Quinn is quite weak right now and has had to rely on burst lethality builds to get some semblance of a good performance. Riot wants to return her basic attack prowess to its former glory in this patch and they'll revisit her if she needs further buffs. Rakan is weaker than he ought to be for most League players, which means Riot wants to buff him. Though this buff looks small, Riot thinks early game engage agency will be quite meaningful for him, but they'll be ready to follow up if it isn't enough. Rell's power has swung a bit back and forth the last few months, but she's currently the #1 support for most League players. Sure, she's a bit of a loner, but that doesn't mean she should be standing so far ahead of everyone else. Riot is delivering some fairly simple durability nerfs as they were very effective last time when they overshot. While Samira experts are actually performing fairly well, Riot wants to open up success to more of her player base. This attack speed buff should be helpful for anyone who can't reliably combo into Inferno trigger in a fraction of a second and for any games where jumping into the enemy team would be met with instant death. So here's a bit more juice for a basic attack pattern, both in early lane and teamfights. Skarner is more mobile than most tanks and has an extremely potent engage and disengage tool in his E. His E already has a built-in 35% cooldown reduction if he stuns a target with it, so the base cooldown has room to go up to make it harder to both engage and escape with it within the same short engagement. Additionally, since Skarner is so mobile, he has room to lose some innate durability to put him more in line with other tanks. Swain's last nerfs took him a bit lower than Riot wanted, so Riot is re-adding some power. The passive health should make him less reliant on further HP purchases, while the AP ratio buff should similarly help him get value from ability power. To be clear, Riot is quite happy that Swain has a mix of viable item options as he's a front-lining battle mage who wants to surround himself with enemy champions, so viable on-brand tank items are fine, but they want to make sure that AP also has its place. Teemo is too good at bullying top lanes at the moment. His strongest lever for reducing this is the upfront on-hit damage of his E, which he can apply frequently against melee matchups before the full poison can tick out. This change dramatically reduces his on-hit damage at rank 1 and 2, but mostly balances out by level 5 when it is less effective since most of mid-late game Teemo's damage comes from mushrooms and not auto attacks. This level 1 nerf will give lane opponents more time to unlock their 3 basic abilities to give them more of a fighting chance against Teemo's harass in lane. Thresh is cool and Riot likes it when he's good. Buffing his base health to let him brawl more in lane and buffing his E passive auto damage to allow him better damage scaling throughout the game. Viego is performing well with a high pick and ban rate, so Riot is toning down his power by walking back the AD he gained from his World's Patch buff. Wukong has recently risen to become the king of the jungle. Riot wants to open up a bit more space in the role, so they're bringing down some of his more recent buffs that proved to be jungle skewed in order to leave top Wukong relatively unaffected. Bloodsong is performing a bit too well, especially on supports such as Poppy and Leona where its pick rate has increased over time, so Riot is nerfing its passive in a way that shouldn't majorly affect its ranged users. Riot is looking to do a nerf to both Bloodsong and Realmspike as a systemic push away from damage supports and try to push players towards tanks and enchanters. Aiming for a small nerf to Realmspike mostly as a placebo to disincentivize players from picking damage supports while not actually lowering its WR too much as it's already on the lower end, especially compared to Bloodsong. Riot is comfortable with the new Domination vision runes for now, but the Domination tree itself is still overall weak. So to balance out that fact, Riot is driving on some keystone buffs across the board with the goal of letting assassins come back to this tree and succeed as they're meant to. For Electrocute, it's an early game focused buff, placing it in clear contrast to First Strike, which is all about waiting for later. Dark Harvest is getting a similar buff to Electrocute, getting 50% more damage in the early game and 25% more damage from its scaling, making it a rune that requires early excellence in order to keep pace and great rewards for those who overachieve. Riot knows that the cooldown buff will disproportionately affect ranged champions, so they're only bumping the attack speed for melee ones.